Hello, I'm Ken Walsh. This is one in my series of videos on Old Testament leaders. Today, I'll be discussing David, who was a brilliant military and political leader and a faithful follower of God, despite his serious flaws. David, along with Abraham and Moses, shaped the development of Judaism, out of which grew Christianity. Both religions have had a huge influence on Western culture. After a short introduction, I'll summarize the David Bible story and provide some commentary for your consideration. A fuller introduction with more presenter information is available on the first video about Abraham. This format is a lecture with slides. By way of background, I taught the Old Testament and ancient history for 14 years at a tuition-free Jesuit inner-city middle school for boys from low-income families of various religious and non-religious backgrounds. My personal challenge was how to make everyone comfortable in my religion class, how to teach without preaching a particular religious point of view to children who range from evangelicals to non-church Christians, atheists, Buddhists, and Muslims. A real mix reflecting life today. This presentation grew out of my teaching and my recently published book, Bible Stories for All Without the Dogma, a part of cultural literacy. The video and my book are an easy-to-follow overview of the Bible stories and their times. They are not a scholarly presentation. However, if you are interested in just the basic facts and their context, I hope you will enjoy my work. As I've mentioned, the Bible has influenced Western culture in many spheres. In fact, biblical references have often been used by leaders to connect with their audience. Examples include Abraham Lincoln's House Divided speech and his second inaugural address. And Martin Luther King's speeches, I've been to the mountaintop and I have a dream. We'll discuss the I have a dream speech later in this video. The story of David describes one of Israel's most admired rulers along with his flaws. Let's take a look at where we are in the span of time. Today, we will focus on a very narrow band of human history around 1000 BCE. It's interesting that a 4,000-year Judeo-Christian heritage has had so much influence on people today, people who have been around for more than 3 million years. As we become an increasingly secular society, many do not understand that influence that has crept into our lives. Our story occurs in the ancient Near East in Israel, which is in the center left portion of the map from Beersheba to Jerusalem to Shechem. We'll talk about David, who was the second king of Israel, in a minute. Unfortunately, the Promised Land was occupied by others, and there were numerous battles over territory in the semi-dry land. In 2 battles, the first king, Saul, did not follow God's instructions as conveyed to him through the prophet Samuel. While God did not remove Saul as the king, God did designate a successor, bypassing Saul's son, who was considered to be next in line. God sent Samuel to Bethlehem to anoint one of Jesse's sons to be the next king after the death of Saul. Upon arriving, Samuel saw a succession of Jesse's sons and thought each one must be the one. But God said to him, "Pay no attention to how tall and handsome he is. I have rejected him, because I do not judge as people judge. They look at the outward appearance, but I look at the heart." When I read this, I often think of this passage in Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. They look at the outward appearance, but I look at the heart. This is such a moving passage, often overlooked, but clearly summing up the essence of life and picked up by Martin Luther King in his memorable paraphrasing. So Jesse brought out 7 of his sons, one by one, but Saul rejected them and inquired if he had any other sons. The youngest son was out taking care of the sheep. Jesse sent for him. God told Samuel that this is the one to anoint. Samuel anointed David in front of his brothers. The Spirit of God was now with David. However, the designation of the next king, that is David, was not announced to Saul or to the people of Israel at this time. When the Spirit of God left Saul, he fell into a depression. His staff asked if they could find someone to play the harp for him and pick up his spirits. Saul agreed, and they sent an attendant to fetch Jesse's son, David, who was known as a good musician. Saul liked David. Whenever Saul was down, David would play his harp and cheer him up. Saul's downfall as a king was caused by the substitution of his own judgment in place of God's clear directions. As a result, his descendants would not rule Israel. God let him finish his reign, but Saul knew he had lost God's confidence. And it showed in his bouts of depression and in his upcoming jealousy of David's accomplishments and popularity. However, Saul's accomplishments were critical in their own right. He established an army, began the transition from 12 tribes to a new kingdom, and defended Israel from the attacking Philistines. His success in organizing the Israelites and defending Israel paved the way for David to build on that progress and expand the kingdom. Saul reigned from approximately 1030 to 1010 BCE. Let's get back to the days of young David under Saul. The Philistines were again gathering to attack the Israelites. They were lined up on one hill and the Israelites on another with a valley between them. A tall, huge man named Goliath came out of the battle line wearing bronze armor and a bronze helmet and carrying a heavy bronze javelin and a bronze shield. Every morning and evening for 40 days, Goliath challenged the Israelites to what was known in the ancient world as single combat. To avoid widespread bloodshed, a combatant would challenge the other side to put up one combatant to fight a duel, typically until the death of one of them. The fight would occur on the open ground between the two opposing armies. Goliath shouted at the Israelites, "What are you doing there, lined up for battle? I am a Philistine, you slaves of Saul. Choose one of your men to fight me. If he wins and kills me, we will be your slaves. But if I win and kill him, you will be our slaves. Here and now, I challenge the Israelite army. I dare you to pick someone to fight me." When Saul and his men heard this, they were terrified. This was understandable, considering Goliath's size and his bronze armor, which the Israelites did not have. One day, Jesse sent David to the Israelite camp to bring food to his brothers who were with Saul's army. He arrived as the soldiers were lining up, and Goliath was challenging them to single combat. Some of the Israelites were running away in terror. Others were mumbling how Saul had promised a big reward to the man who would kill Goliath. He would receive the king's daughter in marriage. Although David's brother tried to send him home, David persisted in asking the soldiers questions. Finally, he approached Saul. "If no one will fight this Philistine," David said, "he would." Saul told him that he was just a boy and that Goliath had been a soldier all his life. But David persisted, saying that as a shepherd, he had killed lions and bears, which were known to roam this area, and he would do the same to this heathen Philistine. God had saved him before, God will save him again. So Saul agreed and gave David his armor, helmet, and sword. However, David was not used to wearing such armor or using such weapons. He took them off. He picked up his shepherd's stick, 5 smooth stones, and his sling, and went to meet Goliath. As Goliath approached and saw that David was just a boy, he cursed David and threatened to give his body to the birds to eat. But David replied that Goliath was coming with a javelin and armor, while he was coming in the name of the God of the Israelite army, and that he, David, would give the bodies of the Philistine soldiers to the birds to eat. As Goliath approached, David walked toward him, reached into his bag, put a stone in his sling, and swung it toward Goliath. It hit Goliath just under his helmet on his unprotected forehead and broke his skull. Such a shot could travel at speeds exceeding 90 miles per hour. The mighty Goliath fell to the ground dead. In panic, the Philistines ran away. The Israelites chased them, wounding and killing many along the way. David returned to Saul a hero. He became a close friend of Saul's son, Jonathan, who was also a hero from his previous battle victory. David was successful on subsequent military missions. Saul made him an officer in his army. The army's officers and men were pleased. David and Jonathan became very close friends. Jonathan even shared his clothes with David. He dealt with his father's subsequent jealousy of David. Jonathan sided with David over his father, and in the ultimate test of friendship, Jonathan risked his life for David. As Saul and David returned from battle, the women in every town came out to greet them. They sang praises to King Saul, noting he had killed thousands. They also sang praises to David, noting he had killed tens of thousands. Saul became angry and then jealous of David's popularity. He thought they might make David the king. The next day, Saul raved about as a madman. As David was playing his harp to cheer him up, Saul picked up a spear and threw it at David twice. Somehow, David managed to dodge each one. Saul was jealous because he realized the Spirit of God was with David and not him. As promised, Saul offered his daughter Michal to David in marriage, if he would also kill 100 Philistines. Saul thought the Philistines would surely kill him. However, David was successful in defeating the Philistines and killing 200 of them. He returned from the battle a hero, and he married Michal. Saul mentioned to his son Jonathan that he planned to kill David. Jonathan was closer to his friend David than to his father, so he warned David to be careful around his father. One day, while David was playing his harp for Saul, Saul grabbed a spear and threw it at David. David ducked just in time, and the spear hit the wall. David fled the palace. That same night, Saul sent men to David's house to kill him. However, Michal learned of the plan and warned him to escape before the men arrived. David was expected to attend the upcoming New Moon festival at the palace. Because he was afraid that Saul would kill him, he had Jonathan explain his absence as a need to visit his own family in Bethlehem for their festival. Saul immediately saw through the excuse. In anger, he threw a spear at his own son, accusing him of siding with David. Jonathan left the table in a rage as he realized just how determined his father was to kill David. David fled to the hill country, also known as the Central Mountains, and lived in the wild, occasionally getting supplies from friendly villages. Saul went looking for David with 3,000 of his best soldiers. After one long day of searching, Saul lay down in a cave to take a nap. Coincidentally, David was hiding farther back in the same cave. He approached the sleeping Saul. David did not kill Saul out of respect for God, who chose Saul as the king. Instead of killing him, David cut off a piece of his robe. When Saul awoke, he asked why David was trying to kill him. David said that you can see by the piece of your cloth that I am holding that I could have killed you. This should convince you I have no evil intentions. Saul started crying. You are right and I am wrong. You've been so good to me while I have done such wrong to you. How often does someone catch an enemy and then let him go away unharmed? Saul acknowledged that David will become the king of Israel. He asked David to spare his descendants. David agreed. This quote, "You are right and I am wrong," is such a gem. Hard to say, but wonderful in its effect. Saul and his sons fought another battle against the Philistines. Many Israelites were killed, including Saul and most of his sons. The Israelites mourned their deaths. As the next king of Israel, David had to fight separatists within Israel and unite the nation. While he was completely devoted to God and able to win the loyalty of the Israelites, he also committed terrible selfish sins. Yet his achievements so impressed the Israelites that during their time in exile, centuries later, they yearned for a king like David, a son of David, a descendant who would be like him. During David's reign, Israel continued its transition from small villages and 12 tribes dependent on farming and herding to a nation with growing cities and increasing economic, political, and military power. After learning of Saul's death, David asked God if he could take control of the tribe of Judah in the southern part of Israel. God agreed. David respectfully did so and met with the people. They publicly anointed David as their king. However, the commander of Saul's army and the surviving son of Saul took control of Israel's other tribes in the north. The rivalry and fighting between Israel and Judah continued for years. Unbeknownst to David, the commander and the son of the Israel tribe were murdered. David, who had earlier declared his loyalty to Saul and promised to care for his descendants, was profoundly saddened. All the tribes then proclaimed their loyalty to David. Israel and Judah were united as Israel again. They publicly anointed David at the age of 30 as their king of Judah and Israel combined. David realized that God had not only made him king, but made his kingdom prosperous. Yet he became upset that he was living in a beautiful cedar house while the covenant box of God was housed in a tent. David decided to build a temple for the covenant box. However, the prophet Nathan visited him with a message from God. David was not to build a temple for God. His son will build it. God had traveled with the Israelites in a tent all these years. God had been with them all this time and made David their ruler. God said, "You will always have descendants, and I will make your kingdom last forever. Your dynasty will never end." This is known as the Davidic covenant, a covenant promising that David's descendants will live on forever. Many believe that the Davidic covenant lives on not only through Judaism, but also through Jesus, a descendant of David and the Christian church, founded on his teachings. On a practical level, there were numerous matters requiring attention in addition to building a temple at this time. David was busy trying to consolidate the 12 tribes into an effective, unified nation. He needed to build the government, organize the army, construct forts, and settle issues of the 12 tribes and the conquered lands. There was a lot of first-time work to do without precedent to guide him. David continued to be successful in his military victories, including defeats of the Philistines, Moabites, Syrians, and Ammonites. One afternoon, while walking in his palace's rooftop garden, he saw a beautiful woman taking a bath in her house across the way. He learned that she was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, an officer in his army who was then attacking the Ammonites. David had Bathsheba brought to him. They made love. She became pregnant while her husband was still on the front. David tried to cover up his adultery by having Uriah brought home on leave to spend a few nights with his wife. The plan failed because Uriah did not believe it was right for him to be home with his wife while his fellow officers and troops were camping in the open near the battlefield. So he slept at the palace gate with the king's guards. Next, David wrote a letter to Uriah's commander, ordering him to put Uriah on the front line in the center where the fighting would be the heaviest, where Uriah would most likely be killed. And he was. When Bathsheba learned of her husband's death, she mourned. After the period of mourning, David had her brought to the palace. He married her, and they had a son. However, God was not pleased with David. God sent his prophet Nathan to see David. Nathan told him a parable, that is, a short story with a moral lesson, about a rich man and a poor man. While the rich man had many cattle and sheep, the poor man had only one lamb, which had grown up with his children. The lamb was like a member of the family. One day, a visitor came to the rich man's house. The rich man needed to provide hospitality, as was the custom, and did not want to kill one of his own animals to prepare a meal for the visitor. Instead, he took the poor man's only lamb. David was angry about the rich man and said he should die and pay 4 times as much as he took. Nathan, in turn, told David that he was that man when he took Uriah's wife. David immediately repented and said he had sinned against God. Nathan informed him that God forgave him and that he would not die, but because of his misdeed, his child would die. And so, a week after his birth, David's son died. Nathan had also predicted that someone from each subsequent generation would die a violent death, and someone from his family would cause trouble for him. David and Bathsheba mourned and comforted each other. Eventually, they had another son, Solomon. The man who had been a fugitive from King Saul, the man who had wandered from cave to cave, hiding from King Saul and his army, was now the king of Israel. Thousands of people worked in his fields and shops. They built his palace, forts, and storerooms for his crops. David had reached his ultimate glory. However, like a true Israelite superhero, the roller coaster ride was about to begin. While David was a success as a warrior and a king, he was a sad failure as a father to his large family of many wives and children. His second oldest son had his slaves kill the oldest son, so the second oldest son would now be next in line to be king. The second oldest son was exiled, years later accepted back, but then led a revolt against his father, David. After the second oldest son died in the revolt, another son decided he wanted to be king now and staged his own coronation. However, he sought and received David's forgiveness after David anointed his son Solomon to be the next king. This was a mess, in addition to the adultery and the staged killing of a man to steal his wife. However, we have the beginnings of a modern state being formed under David. A strong single ruler, a large, well-organized standing army, a national focus to their religion, the organization of a government with the collection of taxes and the appointment of local officials subject to David. Under David, religion moved from a tribal focus to a national one with the installation of the Ark in Jerusalem. Previously, it traveled among the 12 tribes. He is thought to have written 73 of the 150 Psalms in the book of Psalms, a hymn book and prayer book of the Israelites. He also unified the country with the selection of Jerusalem as its capital. The poor country became wealthy with David's conquests and the resulting additions to the national treasury. David was a brilliant military and political leader and a faithful follower of God's commands. However, he did commit serious sins, but he readily acknowledged them and accepted his punishment. Overall, David was without an equal in Israel's history. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. If you have questions or comments, please contact me at kenwalsh3@icloud.com. For more information, please consider my new book, Bible Stories for All Without the Dogma. It is a rare book on just the key stories and their context without religious dogma. The stories include Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, Jacob and Esau, Joseph, Joshua, Deborah, Samson, Ruth, Solomon, the Queen of Sheba, and Esther. You're also welcome to follow me on Facebook at Ken Walsh Author. Thank you for your time today.